The slave auction at the Forks of the Road Market in Natchez, Mississippi on August 15, 1859, would become legendary not for the price paid, but for the mystery that would unfold in its aftermath, a mystery so profound and inexplicable that people would debate its truth for generations. The market was packed with over 400 people, plantation owners from across Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama, slave traders calculating profits, curious spectators drawn by rumors of an extraordinary offering. The air was thick with August heat and the tension of anticipated spectacle. The auctioneer, a man named Josiah Turner who'd conducted sales for 23 years, stood on the platform addressing the unprecedented crowd. "Gentlemen, ladies," Turner announced, his voice carrying across the packed market, "in all my years conducting auctions, I have never presented an offering quite like what you're about to witness. This is not merely a sale, this is an event that will be remembered and discussed for years to come." The crowd pressed forward, anticipation building to an almost unbearable pitch. "The woman you are about to see is 22 years old. Her beauty has been compared to classical paintings, to poetry, to divine art. But beyond appearance, she possesses accomplishments that elevate her far beyond ordinary offerings." Turner paused dramatically, letting the tension build. "She speaks 4 languages fluently: English, French, Spanish, and Italian. She reads and writes with exceptional skill. She is trained in music, piano, harp, and voice. She paints with professional ability. She has been educated in literature, history, and the social graces to a degree that surpasses most ladies of quality. And gentlemen, her temperament is as refined as her appearance is beautiful." The crowd murmured with interest. Such accomplishments in an enslaved woman were rare. They represented years of investment and training. "I present to you Evangeline." A woman was brought forward onto the auction platform. The crowd fell into absolute, stunned silence. Evangeline was indeed extraordinarily beautiful, but in a way that seemed almost otherworldly. She stood perhaps 5 feet 7 inches tall, with porcelain skin that suggested mixed European ancestry, delicate features that could have been sculpted by a master artist, and eyes of an unusual violet-blue color that seemed to see through people rather than at them. Her hair, a deep auburn, was arranged in an elegant style. She wore a simple but well-made dress that emphasized her graceful bearing. But it was more than physical beauty. Evangeline carried herself with such natural elegance and dignity that several people in the crowd unconsciously held their breath. She looked not like property being sold, but like a visiting princess surveying her domain. She stood on the auction block and met the crowd's gaze directly, her expression serene and untroubled, as if the auction were happening to someone else and she was merely an interested observer. Standing near the back of the crowd, partially hidden by taller men, was a young black woman named Naomi. She was 24 years old, enslaved on a plantation outside Natchez, and she'd been sent to the market to observe prices for her owner who was considering selling several workers. Naomi watched Evangeline on the auction block and felt something strange, a recognition, though she'd never seen this woman before. Something about Evangeline's bearing, her eyes, the way she held herself with such calm despite the dehumanizing situation, struck Naomi as deeply unusual. Then Naomi saw something that made her breath catch. Evangeline's hands were making small, subtle movements. They weren't the hand signals enslaved people used to communicate silently. These were different, more deliberate, almost ritualistic. And Evangeline's lips were moving slightly, as if she were speaking words too quiet to be heard, words that might have been a prayer or an incantation or something else entirely. "Bidding will commence at $3,000, Turner announced, an enormous sum that reflected Evangeline's exceptional training and appearance. "5,000, called a voice immediately, a wealthy cotton planter named Harrison Webb. "7,000, countered another bidder, Philippe Merchant, who owned a large estate in Louisiana. The price climbed rapidly. 10,000, 12,000, 15,000. The bidding war was fierce, with multiple wealthy men competing for possession of this extraordinary woman. Naomi watched the bidding with growing unease. There was something about Evangeline's calm, about her subtle hand movements, about the way she seemed completely unaffected by being auctioned, that suggested this wasn't what it appeared to be. $25,000, called a new voice that silenced the crowd. Everyone turned to see who'd bid such an unprecedented sum. He was a man in his early 50s, impeccably dressed, with distinguished features and an air of immense wealth and authority. He introduced himself as Marcus Beaumont, owner of one of the largest plantations in Mississippi, 10,000 acres, over 300 enslaved workers, and resources that dwarfed most of his competitors. $25,000, Turner repeated, his voice shaking slightly with the magnitude of the bid. Does anyone wish to challenge Mr. Beaumont's offer? The remaining bidders looked at each other, calculating. $25,000 was more than most plantations were worth. It was an impossible, irrational sum. But Marcus Beaumont's reputation was such that no one dared challenge him. He was known to be ruthlessly competitive and virtually unlimited in resources. $25,000 going once, Turner called. Going twice. Sold to Mr. Marcus Beaumont for $25,000, the highest price ever paid for any enslaved person in Mississippi history. The crowd erupted in applause and shocked murmurs. $25,000 for a single woman, regardless of her accomplishments or beauty, was unprecedented. Marcus Beaumont approached the platform to claim his purchase. He looked at Evangeline with an expression that was difficult to read, triumph certainly, but also something that might have been recognition or understanding or satisfaction beyond simple acquisition. "You're mine now," Beaumont said to Evangeline, his voice low but carrying to those nearby. "Yes, master," Evangeline replied in a voice that was cultured, composed, and carried just a hint of something that might have been amusement. "I am yours." But Naomi, watching closely, saw Evangeline's lips move again in those silent words, saw her hands make subtle gestures, and had the strangest conviction that Evangeline had wanted to be sold to Marcus Beaumont specifically. That the entire auction, despite its apparent spontaneity, had been orchestrated somehow to achieve exactly this outcome. As Beaumont led Evangeline from the auction house toward his waiting carriage, Naomi noticed something else. Several people in the crowd were watching the transaction with unusual intensity. Not the normal interest of spectators, but focused, purposeful attention that suggested they were monitoring rather than merely observing. One was an elderly black woman dressed as a servant but carrying herself with subtle authority. Another was a white man, middle-aged and plainly dressed, who'd been taking notes throughout the auction. A third was a younger black man who'd been sketching the proceedings. These weren't casual observers. They were documenting the sale for some specific purpose. Naomi filed these observations away, her curiosity intensifying. Something about this auction was different from the hundreds of slave sales that happened throughout Mississippi. The astronomical price, Evangeline's strange calm, the deliberate observers, Beaumont's apparent satisfaction. It all suggested something more was happening than a simple, if extravagant, purchase. Over the next days, Naomi couldn't stop thinking about the auction and about Evangeline's enigmatic presence. She made inquiries, carefully and discreetly, trying to learn more about the legendary Evangeline and about Marcus Beaumont. What she learned was intriguing and contradictory. Evangeline, according to auction records, had been enslaved in New Orleans for the past 3 years, owned by a wealthy French merchant who'd invested heavily in her education and training. The merchant had died suddenly, and his estate was being liquidated, which was how Evangeline came to be auctioned in Natchez. But there were inconsistencies in the story. Some people claimed Evangeline had been educated in Paris. Others said she'd been born enslaved, but had received unprecedented educational opportunities. Still others whispered that Evangeline wasn't what she appeared to be, that her enslavement was somehow irregular or mysterious. And Marcus Beaumont, Naomi learned, had a curious history. He was immensely wealthy and owned one of Mississippi's largest plantations. But he rarely attended slave auctions personally, preferring to send overseers to make purchases. His personal appearance at the Natchez auction, his willingness to pay an unprecedented sum, suggested that acquiring Evangeline specifically was enormously important to him. Beaumont's been looking for someone like Evangeline for years, an older enslaved woman named Patience told Naomi. Word is he's been searching for a specific type of woman, educated, beautiful, refined, with particular qualities he won't specify. He's purchased several highly educated women over the past decade, paid enormous sums for each one, and then they disappear. Disappear, Naomi asked. What do you mean? They're never seen again, Patience said. Beaumont takes them to his plantation and they vanish. Some say he frees them and sends the M away. Others say he's doing something darker. But nobody knows for certain because nobody who goes to Beaumont's estate ever comes back to tell the story. Naomi felt a chill. If Beaumont was harming the women he purchased, if Evangeline was in danger, shouldn't someone try to help her? But how could an enslaved woman with no power or resources help someone who'd just been sold to one of Mississippi's most powerful men? 3 weeks after the auction, Naomi had an opportunity she hadn't anticipated. Her owner sent her to make a delivery to a plantation near Beaumont's estate, which gave Naomi a legitimate reason to be in the area. On her return journey, Naomi detoured past Beaumont's property, a massive estate called Shadowmere that sprawled across thousands of acres of prime Mississippi land. The main house was an impressive Greek Revival mansion, surrounded by elaborate gardens, outbuildings, and the quarters where over 300 enslaved workers lived. But there was something about the property that struck Naomi as strange. It was too quiet, too controlled, with an atmosphere of secrecy that made her uneasy. As Naomi watched from the concealment of trees along the road, she saw a figure appear briefly at one of the mansion's upper-floor windows. A woman, tall and elegant with auburn hair. Evangeline. She stood at the window for a long moment, looking out over the grounds. And then, impossibly, she seemed to look directly at where Naomi was hiding, despite the distance and the concealment. Their eyes met across perhaps 100 yards, and Naomi saw Evangeline smile slightly and raise one hand in a subtle gesture, not a wave, but something more deliberate, like a signal or a blessing or an acknowledgement. Then Evangeline stepped back from the window and disappeared. Naomi stood frozen, her mind racing. How had Evangeline known she was there? How had she seen Naomi through the trees at that distance? And what had that gesture meant? As Naomi turned to leave, she nearly collided with someone who'd approached silently behind her, the elderly black woman from the auction, the one who'd been watching with such focused attention. "You're curious about Evangeline?" the woman said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Who are you?" Naomi asked warily. "My name is Ruth, and I'm here to tell you that Evangeline is not what she appears to be, that what's happening at Shadowmere is not what it seems, and that you've been chosen to witness something that will challenge everything you believe about power, enslavement, and the impossible." "Chosen by whom?" Naomi demanded. Ruth smiled. "By Evangeline herself. She saw you at the auction. She's been watching you. And now she wants you to see the truth, to be a witness to what's about to unfold. Because what happens next at Shadowmere will be inexplicable, impossible, and will change Mississippi in ways no one can predict." Naomi wanted to dismiss this as nonsense, as the ravings of someone caught up in superstition or fantasy. But Ruth's eyes were clear and intelligent, and something in her tone suggested she was speaking literal truth, however impossible that truth might be. "What's going to happen?" Naomi asked. "Something that shouldn't be possible," Ruth replied. "Something that will make people question everything they think they know about slavery, power, and human capability. And you, Naomi, are going to help tell that story. You're going to be the witness who ensures the truth is remembered." Before Naomi could respond, Ruth melted back into the trees and disappeared, leaving Naomi alone with more questions than answers and the growing conviction that the most beautiful female slave ever auctioned in Mississippi was at the center of a mystery that defied rational explanation. A month after the auction, Naomi received an unexpected visitor at the small cabin she shared with 3 other enslaved women on her owner's plantation. It was Ruth, the elderly woman who'd approached her near Shadowmere. "Come with me," Ruth said quietly. "Evangeline has requested to meet you tonight at a location where we can speak freely." "Why would she want to meet me?" Naomi asked, torn between curiosity and caution. "I'm nobody, just an enslaved seamstress. What could she possibly want with me?" "You're a witness," Ruth said, "and Evangeline needs witnesses for what she's about to do. Will you come?" Against her better judgment, Naomi agreed. That night, she slipped away from the plantation, a dangerous act that could result in severe punishment if discovered, and followed Ruth through darkened woods to a small cabin hidden deep in a cypress swamp. Inside the cabin, Evangeline was waiting. Seeing her up close, Naomi was struck again by Evangeline's extraordinary appearance. But it was more than physical beauty. There was something about Evangeline's presence that seemed to fill the space, an intensity and focus that made her impossible to ignore. "Thank you for coming," Evangeline said, her voice cultured and warm. "I know you're risking punishment by being here. Your courage is appreciated." "What do you want from me?" Naomi asked directly. "I want to tell you the truth," Evangeline replied. "About who I am, about why I arranged to be sold to Marcus Beaumont, and about what I'm going to do at Shadowmere Plantation. And then I want you to remember that truth and share it, so that when people try to dismiss what happens as impossible or fabricated, there will be witnesses who can testify otherwise." "What truth?" Naomi asked. Evangeline took a deep breath, then spoke words that would change Naomi's understanding of everything. "My real name is Evangeline Dubois. I'm a free woman from Haiti. I was never enslaved. I deliberately arranged false documentation showing me as enslaved property, specifically so I could be auctioned and purchased by Marcus Beaumont." Naomi stared at her in shock. "You let yourself be sold deliberately. Why?" "Because Marcus Beaumont is not what he appears to be," Evangeline said. "He presents himself as a wealthy plantation owner, but in reality, he's the leader of a secret organization that has been systematically kidnapping free black people throughout the South and selling them into slavery. Over the past 15 years, Beaumont's network has illegally enslaved over 400 people, free citizens whose lives and freedom were stolen." She paused, letting that horrifying information sink in. "I've spent 3 years infiltrating Beaumont's network, gathering evidence, documenting crimes. The auction in Natchez was the final step, getting inside Beaumont's household where the network's operations are coordinated and where records are kept. Once I'm inside Shadowmere, I'll gather the final evidence needed to expose and destroy the entire organization." "But if Beaumont's that dangerous," Naomi said, "won't he kill you when he discovers what you're doing?" "Perhaps," Evangeline acknowledged. "Which is why I need witnesses on the outside, people who know the truth, who can testify if something happens to me, who can ensure the evidence reaches authorities even if I don't survive." "Why me?" Naomi asked. "You don't know me, why trust me with this?" "Because you saw," Evangeline said simply. "At the auction you saw that something was wrong, that the situation wasn't what it appeared to be. You paid attention when others didn't. You questioned when others simply accepted. That makes you valuable, someone whose instincts can recognize truth and whose testimony can be trusted." Ruth spoke up. "Naomi, I'm part of a network that's been helping Evangeline. We're freed people, abolitionists, and Underground Railroad operatives working to expose and destroy kidnapping operations throughout the South. What Evangeline is attempting is the most dangerous mission we've ever undertaken. If she succeeds, we'll free over 400 people and destroy a criminal network that's operated with impunity for 15 years. But if she fails..." "If I fail," Evangeline continued, "the network will continue, more people will be kidnapped and enslaved, and no one will ever know how close we came to stopping them. That's why I need you, Naomi. I need someone outside Shadowmere who knows the truth and who can act if I can't." Naomi felt overwhelmed. This was so far beyond anything she'd imagined. A free woman deliberately enslaving herself, an international criminal network, a mission that could free hundreds of people or end in murder. "What do you need me to do?" Naomi asked. "Watch," Evangeline said. "Pay attention to Shadowmere. If you notice unusual activity, if you see federal marshals or authorities arriving, if you observe people leaving the plantation in unusual ways, if anything seems wrong, send word to Ruth immediately. She'll know what to do. And if something happens to you, then you testify," Evangeline said firmly. "You tell authorities what I told you tonight. You describe the kidnapping network, you name Marcus Beaumont as its leader, and you ensure that even if I die, the truth isn't buried with me." Over the next hour, Evangeline provided detailed information. Names of people in the kidnapping network, locations where victims were held before being sold, methods used to create false documentation showing free people as enslaved property, and most importantly, the location within Shadowmere Mansion where Beaumont kept comprehensive records of the network's operations. "These records are the key," Evangeline explained. "They document every kidnapping, every sale, every person involved. With those records, federal authorities can prosecute everyone in the network and free every victim who can be located. My mission is to access those records, copy the critical information, and get it to people who can act on it." "How will you access Beaumont's records?" Naomi asked. "Won't he be watching you?" "He'll be watching, Evangeline agreed. But Beaumont has a weakness. He's obsessed with beautiful, educated women. He's purchased 7 over the past decade, all fitting the same description, all highly trained and refined. He doesn't harm them physically. His obsession is psychological. He wants to own exceptional women, to control them, to prove his power over people who should be beyond his reach. That obsession will give me access to his household, to his study, to the areas where records are kept. He'll trust me more quickly than he should because I fit his specific fascination, and I'll use that access to complete my mission. But there's something else, Evangeline said, her expression growing more intense. Something I haven't told anyone except Ruth and a few others in the network. Something that's going to make what happens at Shadowmere seem inexplicable to everyone who witnesses it. What? Naomi asked. Evangeline stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark swamp. I have abilities that most people don't possess. Abilities I was born with and have developed over years of training. Abilities that will allow me to do things that appear impossible. What kind of abilities? Naomi asked, remembering Evangeline's subtle hand movements and silent words at the auction. I can influence people's perceptions, Evangeline said carefully. I can make them see what I want them to see, believe what I want them to believe, overlook things I don't want them to notice. It's not magic. It's a combination of psychology, focused attention, and abilities that some people are born with but most never develop. She turned to face Naomi. My abilities will help me access areas I shouldn't be able to reach, convince people to trust me when they shouldn't, and gather evidence without being detected. But to anyone watching, what I do will seem inexplicable. They'll see me in places I couldn't have reached, accessing information I shouldn't have been able to find, accomplishing things that appear impossible. That's why I need witnesses like you, Evangeline continued. People who know in advance that I have these abilities, who can testify that what they witness isn't supernatural or fabricated. It's real, just operating through means most people don't understand. Naomi struggled to process this information. Abilities to influence perception. It sounded like the kind of thing people whispered about in stories. Conjure, rootwork, powers that transcended normal human capability. Are you saying you practice conjure? Naomi asked carefully. I'm saying I have abilities, Evangeline replied. Call them what you want. Conjure, mesmerism, focused consciousness, psychological manipulation. The terminology doesn't matter. What matters is that I can do things that will help me complete my mission, and that those things will seem inexplicable to people who witness them. Will you demonstrate? Naomi asked. Evangeline smiled. Look at me, Naomi. Look directly into my eyes. Naomi did, and suddenly, impossibly, the cabin around them seemed to shift. The walls appeared to fade, the lamplight changed color, and for a brief moment, Naomi could have sworn she was standing in a completely different location. A grand parlor with expensive furniture and portraits on the walls. Then Naomi blinked, and everything was normal again. The cabin was just a cabin, the lamplight was ordinary, and the momentary vision of a grand parlor was gone. What did you do? Naomi whispered. I briefly shared my perception with you, Evangeline explained. Showed you an image from my memory, the parlor at Shadowmere where I'll be working. For a moment, your consciousness connected with mine, and you saw what I was visualizing. That's the kind of thing I can do: influence perception, share images, create momentary connections that transcend normal sensory experience. That's impossible, Naomi said. And yet you experienced it, Evangeline replied. Naomi, the world contains more possibilities than most people acknowledge. Some people have abilities that seem impossible until you witness them directly. I'm one of those people. And I'm going to use my abilities to destroy Beaumont's network and free hundreds of enslaved people. Naomi left the swamp cabin that night with her mind reeling. Everything Evangeline had told her, the deliberate false enslavement, the kidnapping network, the mission to gather evidence, and especially the inexplicable abilities, seemed impossible. But Naomi had seen the vision of Shadowmere's parlor, had felt the reality of that momentary connection, had experienced something that defied rational explanation. Which meant Evangeline was telling the truth, which meant something extraordinary and possibly dangerous was about to happen at Shadowmere Plantation. Over the following weeks, Naomi watched Shadowmere from a distance whenever she had opportunities. She saw nothing obviously unusual. The plantation operated normally with workers laboring in fields, overseers supervising, and the big house standing as it always had. But Ruth provided occasional updates through covert meetings. Evangeline has gained Beaumont's trust faster than anticipated. She's been given access to areas of the house that previous women weren't allowed to enter. She's beginning to locate the records we need. "Is she safe?" Naomi asked. "For now," Ruth said. "But Beaumont is becoming possessive. He's keeping Evangeline isolated from other workers, controlling her movements, monitoring her constantly. We have perhaps 2 weeks before his control becomes absolute and Evangeline loses the freedom of movement she needs to complete the mission." "What happens in 2 weeks?" Naomi asked. "Everything," Ruth replied. "Either Evangeline gathers the evidence and we execute the exposure plan, or Beaumont discovers her true purpose and, well, we don't discuss what happens then." 2 weeks later, on a humid October night, everything changed. Naomi was awakened from sleep by someone shaking her shoulder. It was Ruth, her expression urgent. "Come now, quickly. Evangeline needs you at Shadowmere. Something's happened, something that's going to seem impossible but that you need to witness and remember." Naomi dressed quickly and followed Ruth through the darkness to Shadowmere's edge. They stopped in the trees, hidden from view but with clear sight of the mansion. And there Naomi saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Something inexplicable, impossible, and absolutely real. What Naomi witnessed from the concealment of the trees that October night would defy everything she thought she knew about what was possible. The mansion house at Shadowmere was ablaze with light, every window illuminated, figures moving inside, and the sound of shouting carrying across the grounds. But it wasn't the activity that shocked Naomi. It was what she could see happening inside the house itself. Through the large parlor windows, visible clearly in the bright lamplight, Naomi saw Evangeline standing in the center of the room surrounded by Marcus Beaumont and 4 other men, all white, all clearly agitated and angry. Beaumont was holding papers and shouting, his face purple with rage. The other men had weapons drawn, pistols pointed at Evangeline. "She's caught," Naomi whispered to Ruth in horror. "They've discovered who she is. They're going to kill her." "Watch," Ruth said calmly. "Just watch." As Naomi watched, Evangeline raised her hands slowly, palms outward in a gesture that was somehow both surrendering and commanding. Her lips moved, speaking words Naomi couldn't hear from this distance. And then, impossibly, the men surrounding Evangeline began to lower their weapons. Their expressions, which had been furious and violent, shifted to confusion, and then to a strange blankness, as if they were struggling to remember why they were angry. Beaumont dropped the papers he'd been holding. His weapon arm dropped to his side. He stared at Evangeline with an expression of bewilderment. Evangeline continued speaking, her hands making subtle gestures, her entire bearing radiating a calm authority that seemed to fill the room even through the windows. The men began backing away from her. One by one, they holstered their weapons or set them down. Their aggressive postures relaxed. They looked at each other in confusion, as if they'd forgotten what they'd been doing. Then Evangeline made a sweeping gesture, and every lamp in the parlor suddenly went dark, all at once, as if an invisible hand had extinguished them simultaneously. The mansion was plunged into darkness for perhaps 3 seconds. Then the lamps rekindled, again all at once, impossibly synchronized. But when the light returned, the scene in the parlor had changed completely. Evangeline was no longer surrounded. Instead, she was calmly gathering papers from Beaumont's desk, sorting through documents with methodical efficiency. The men who'd been threatening her moments earlier were standing motionless around the room, their expressions blank, their bodies still as statues. "What's happening?" Naomi whispered. "What did she do to them?" "She's using her abilities," Ruth replied. "Influencing their perceptions, calming their aggression, creating momentary paralysis through focused consciousness control. It shouldn't be possible, but you're witnessing it." Naomi watched in awe and terror as Evangeline worked. She moved through the paralyzed men as if they were furniture, accessing drawers and cabinets, gathering documents, photographing pages with a small camera that must have been hidden in her clothing. For perhaps 20 minutes, the men remained motionless while Evangeline systematically gathered evidence. Then, her work apparently complete, Evangeline made another gesture. The men suddenly animated, blinking in confusion. They looked around the parlor as if unsure how they'd gotten there or what they'd been doing. Beaumont noticed the scattered papers on his desk, but seemed unable to remember why they'd been disturbed. Evangeline spoke again, words Naomi still couldn't hear, and the men nodded as if she'd said something completely ordinary and reasonable. Then they filed out of the parlor, leaving Evangeline alone. She looked directly toward where Naomi and Ruth were hidden, though she couldn't possibly have seen them in the darkness at that distance. She raised one hand in a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. "She knows we're watching," Ruth whispered. "She wanted us to see what she can do." "But how is any of that possible?" Naomi asked. "How did she extinguish all those lamps at once? How did she paralyze those men? How?" "We don't know," Ruth admitted. "Evangeline has tried to explain her abilities, but even she doesn't fully understand the mechanisms. She was born with these capacities and has spent years training to develop and control them. But whether they're natural human abilities that most people never access or something beyond normal human capability, we simply don't know." Over the next hour, Naomi and Ruth watched as more impossible things happened at Shadowmere. They saw Evangeline move through the mansion accessing areas that should have been locked or guarded. Doors opened before her as if unlocking themselves. Guards who should have stopped her seemed to look right through her, as if she were invisible. At one point, Naomi saw Evangeline standing in what appeared to be Beaumont's private study, a room on the mansion's second floor that required passing through locked doors and past multiple guards. Yet Evangeline was there, photographing documents completely undetected. "How did she get into that room?" Naomi demanded. "I've been watching. I didn't see her go upstairs. The doors were guarded. How is she in there?" "I don't know," Ruth said, and for the first time her voice carried genuine uncertainty. "Even understanding what Evangeline can do, I'm not sure how she's accomplishing some of this. It's as if physical barriers don't exist for her, as if she can move through space in ways that shouldn't be possible." Near midnight, the activity at the mansion increased dramatically. Federal marshals arrived, a dozen armed men with legal warrants. They'd been positioned nearby, waiting for Evangeline's signal that she'd gathered sufficient evidence. Naomi watched as the marshals surrounded Shadowmere and began arresting people. Marcus Beaumont, the men who'd been in the parlor, overseers, guards, and others who'd been part of the kidnapping network. Beaumont was shouting, protesting his innocence, demanding to know what he was being charged with. The lead marshal simply held up a thick folder of documents, evidence Evangeline had gathered over the past weeks. "Marcus Beaumont, you're under arrest for kidnapping free citizens, conspiracy to enslave, fraud, and multiple violations of federal law," the marshal announced. "The evidence against you and your organization is overwhelming and well documented." Beaumont's face went pale as he realized the scope of what was happening. "This is impossible. Those records were locked in my private study. No one could have accessed them without my knowledge. You must have fabricated this evidence." "The evidence is authentic," the marshal said. "Photographed directly from your own records along with corroborating testimony and documentation. Mr. Beaumont, your network is finished." As the arrests continued, Evangeline emerged from the mansion. She was carrying a large satchel filled with documents and photographic plates, the evidence she'd gathered over weeks of dangerous work. She walked calmly through the chaos of arrests and marshals, seemingly unaffected by the turmoil around her. And as she passed near where Naomi and Ruth were hidden, she looked directly at their location and smiled. "It's done," Evangeline called quietly, knowing somehow that they could hear her. "The network is exposed, the evidence is secure, and 400 people are going to be freed." Then impossibly, Evangeline seemed to simply vanish. One moment she was visible in the lamplight, walking across Shadowmere's grounds. The next moment she was gone, disappeared without a trace, as if she'd never been there at all. Naomi blinked in shock. Where did she go? She was right there, and then, nothing. How is that possible? "I don't know," Ruth admitted, her own voice filled with wonder. "Evangeline has abilities beyond what any of us fully understand, but whatever she did, however she accomplished it, she succeeded in her mission. The kidnapping network is exposed, Beaumont is arrested, and the evidence she gathered will free hundreds of people." Over the following days, the full scope of what Evangeline had accomplished became clear. The documents she'd gathered proved that Marcus Beaumont had been the leader of a massive criminal network operating across 7 southern states. The network had systematically kidnapped free black people, created false documentation showing them as fugitive slaves or as property whose ownership could be disputed, and then sold them to plantation owners throughout the Deep South. Over 400 people had been illegally enslaved through this network. The records Evangeline photographed included names, dates, locations, and details about each kidnapping, evidence so comprehensive that prosecutors called it the most well-documented criminal conspiracy they'd ever encountered. Federal authorities used Evangeline's evidence to arrest over 60 people involved in the network: kidnappers, document forgers, corrupt officials, plantation owners who'd knowingly purchased illegally enslaved people, and slave traders who'd transported the victims. The trials generated national attention. Northern newspapers published extensive coverage about the kidnapping network and the mysterious woman who'd infiltrated it to gather evidence. Who is Evangeline? Journalists demanded. How did she access Beaumont's records? How did she escape detection long enough to photograph such comprehensive documentation? And where is she now? No one could answer these questions. Evangeline had disappeared after delivering the evidence to federal marshals. Some people claimed to have seen her in New Orleans, others in Boston, still others in Haiti. But no one could definitively locate her or confirm her whereabouts. Naomi was interviewed by federal authorities and by journalists. She described what she'd witnessed that October night. Evangeline surrounded by armed men, the impossible paralysis of those men, the extinguishing and rekindling of lamps, the apparent invisibility and teleportation. "You're describing impossible things," a federal prosecutor said. "Miss Naomi, are you certain of what you saw? Could you have been mistaken?" "I saw what I saw," Naomi insisted. "I know it sounds impossible, but I watched it happen. That woman has abilities that can't be explained by normal understanding. She can influence people's perceptions, move in ways that seem to transcend physical barriers, and accomplish things that shouldn't be possible." The prosecutor included Naomi's testimony in the trial record, though he also noted that her descriptions contained elements that strain credibility and suggest either misperception or exaggeration due to the dramatic circumstances. But Ruth, who was also interviewed, corroborated everything Naomi had described. Evangeline Dubois possesses abilities that few people have and fewer still can understand. What she accomplished at Shadowmere appears impossible to those unfamiliar with human consciousness's full potential. But I assure you, everything described by witnesses is accurate. The trials resulted in convictions for most of the network's members. Marcus Beaumont was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Other conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. And most importantly, the 400 people who'd been illegally enslaved through the network were identified and freed. Federal authorities used Beaumont's meticulous records to locate victims, verify their free status, and provide legal documentation of their freedom. It was one of the largest mass liberations in American history before the Civil War. But the mystery of Evangeline Dubois remained. Who was she really? Where had she acquired her inexplicable abilities? How had she accomplished things that seemed to violate natural law? And where had she disappeared to after completing her mission? 6 months after the arrests at Shadowmere, Naomi received an unexpected visitor at the plantation where she was still enslaved. It was a white woman, perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed and carrying papers. She introduced herself as Catherine Morrison, an attorney from Boston working with abolitionist organizations. "Miss Naomi, I represent parties who are grateful for your testimony in the Beaumont case," Morrison said. "Your willingness to describe what you witnessed, despite how inexplicable it seemed, was crucial to establishing the credibility of the evidence. As a token of appreciation, my clients have purchased your freedom." She handed Naomi legal papers, manumission documents declaring Naomi a free person, no longer enslaved. Naomi stared at the papers, unable to believe what she was holding. "Who paid for this? Who are your clients?" "I'm not at liberty to identify them specifically," Morrison said, "but I can tell you they're people who were freed because of the evidence Evangeline gathered. They pooled resources to purchase the freedom of witnesses who testified in the trials. You're one of 12 people being freed this month." Naomi felt tears streaming down her face. After 24 years of enslavement, she was free, and her freedom had come as a result of witnessing and testifying about Evangeline's impossible mission. "Where is she?" Naomi asked. "Where is Evangeline?" Morrison smiled slightly. "I'm not certain. She moves between locations, never staying anywhere long, but she asked me to deliver a message to you if I had the opportunity." Morrison pulled a sealed letter from her bag and handed it to Naomi. "She wanted you to have this." After Morrison left, Naomi opened the letter. It was written in elegant handwriting, clearly from Evangeline. "Dear Naomi asterisk, thank you for being a witness. Your testimony helped validate evidence that skeptics wanted to dismiss as fabricated or impossible. Because you described what you saw honestly, even though it defied explanation, people believed that something extraordinary had occurred, and that belief gave weight to the evidence I gathered. You asked questions about my abilities that I attempted to answer but perhaps didn't fully explain. I want to be clearer now, in writing, about what I can do and why. I was born in Haiti to parents who practiced traditions that blended African spiritual practices with European esoteric knowledge. From childhood, I was trained in techniques for focusing consciousness, influencing perception, and accessing abilities most people never develop. Some call these abilities supernatural. I believe they're natural human capacities that remain dormant in most people but can be awakened through training. What you witnessed at Shadowmere, the paralysis of armed men, the extinguishing of lamps, the apparent teleportation, the invisibility, all of it operates through principles of consciousness and perception that Western science doesn't yet fully understand. But they're real abilities, not tricks or illusions. I can influence how people perceive me, making them overlook my presence, making them forget our interactions, making them see me as non-threatening even when I'm doing things that should alarm them. I can affect physical objects through focused consciousness, not moving them telekinetically in the way stories describe, but influencing their state through means I don't fully understand myself. And I can connect my consciousness with others, sharing perceptions, transmitting images, creating momentary bonds that allow me to sense what others sense, and to show them what I'm experiencing. These abilities made my infiltration of Beaumont's network possible. They allowed me to access areas I shouldn't have reached, to gather evidence without detection, and to escape when I was discovered. But more importantly, they allowed me to complete a mission that would have been impossible through conventional means. 400 people are free because I had abilities that transcended normal limitations. That's why I've spent years developing these capacities, not for personal gain, but to fight injustices that conventional methods can't address. I'm writing to ask you to do something for me. Tell this story. Tell people about what you witnessed, about what I can do, about how abilities that seem impossible can be used to fight oppression and free people. Some will believe you, others won't. But the story needs to be told because it represents a truth most people deny. That human consciousness contains more possibilities than conventional understanding acknowledges. You're free now, free to live your own life, free to use your voice, free to tell truths that need telling. Use that freedom to share what you witnessed. Be the witness I needed you to be. With gratitude and respect. Evangeline Dubois. Naomi kept that letter for the rest of her life. And she did what Evangeline had asked. She told the story over and over to anyone who would listen. She moved to Boston, where she worked with abolitionist organizations and with freed people's communities. She spoke at churches and public gatherings, describing what she'd witnessed at Shadowmere Plantation. I saw things that shouldn't be possible, Naomi would tell audiences. A woman who could paralyze armed men with gestures, who could move through locked doors without keys, who could become invisible and disappear without trace. I know how it sounds. I know people think I'm exaggerating or mistaken. But I saw what I saw, and I'm telling you that human beings are capable of more than we acknowledge. Some people believed her. Others dismissed her testimony as superstition or fantasy. But everyone who heard Naomi speak remembered the conviction in her voice and the detail in her descriptions. This wasn't someone making up stories, but someone reporting what she'd genuinely experienced. The mystery of Evangeline Dubois continued for decades. She appeared occasionally in historical records. A woman matching her description was reported in Haiti in 1862, working with resistance movements against French colonial influence. Another report placed her in Brazil in 1870, helping establish communities for escaped slaves. Still another claimed to have seen her in New Orleans in 1880, working with freed people during Reconstruction. But no one could definitively track her movements or confirm her whereabouts. She remained an enigma, a woman who'd infiltrated a massive criminal network, gathered evidence that freed hundreds of people, and displayed abilities that defied explanation. Historians and researchers tried to investigate Evangeline's story. They examined the trial records from the Beaumont case, interviewed witnesses, and attempted to verify the more inexplicable aspects of the accounts. What they found was intriguing. Multiple witnesses corroborated the basic facts, that Evangeline had infiltrated Shadowmere, had gathered comprehensive evidence despite being under constant surveillance, and had escaped without detection after being discovered. But the witnesses' descriptions of how she'd accomplished these things varied wildly and included elements that seemed impossible. Either multiple credible witnesses experienced shared delusions, one historian wrote in 1895, or Evangeline Dubois possessed abilities that challenge our understanding of human capability. Given that these witnesses had no apparent motive to fabricate, and given the consistency of their core testimony despite variations in detail, I'm inclined toward the latter conclusion, however unsettling. Naomi lived until 1901, spending her final decades documenting the stories of freed people and advocating for civil rights. She died at age 66, having spent 37 years as a free woman, far longer than the 24 years she'd spent enslaved. In her final interview, conducted just months before her death, Naomi was asked one more time about Evangeline and about whether she still believed the impossible things she'd claimed to witness. "I know what I saw," Naomi said, her voice still strong despite her age. "I watched a woman do things that shouldn't be possible, influence people's consciousness, affect physical objects through focused will, move in ways that transcended normal physical limitations. I don't understand how she did these things. Maybe no one fully understands, but they were real. And the larger truth," Naomi continued, "is that Evangeline used those abilities to free 400 people from illegal enslavement. That's what matters most. Not whether her methods were conventional, but whether they were effective and just. She fought oppression using every tool available to her, including abilities most people don't believe exist. And she won." The interviewer asked one final question. "Do you think Evangeline is still alive? She'd be in her 60s now. Do you think she's still out there somewhere, still using her abilities to help people?" Naomi smiled. "I think Evangeline will be helping people as long as injustice exists. Whether she's still physically alive, I don't know. But her legacy lives in the people she freed, in the network she destroyed, and in the proof she provided that human capability extends far beyond what conventional understanding acknowledges." The incredible mystery of the most beautiful female slave ever auctioned in Mississippi was never fully solved. Researchers never definitively explained how Evangeline had accomplished what she did, never verified all the details of her background, never located her after she disappeared from Shadowmere. But what was verified was the impact. 400 people freed, a massive criminal network destroyed, over 60 criminals prosecuted and imprisoned, and a demonstration that even the most entrenched evil could be fought and defeated through courage, intelligence, and abilities that transcended conventional limitations. Years later in 1925, a researcher investigating the Beaumont case discovered something intriguing in the archives of a New Orleans library. A journal, donated anonymously, written by someone who identified herself as E.D. The journal documented decades of work fighting slavery and oppression throughout the Americas. It described missions in Louisiana, Mississippi, Haiti, Brazil, and Cuba. It detailed techniques for infiltrating criminal organizations, for gathering evidence under impossible circumstances, and for using advanced consciousness abilities to accomplish things that appeared supernatural. And it included detailed descriptions of the Shadowmere mission, how Evangeline had infiltrated Beaumont's network, the abilities she'd used to gather evidence, and the inexplicable things witnesses had reported. "I've spent my life developing abilities most people deny exist," one journal entry read. "I've used these abilities to fight injustice in ways conventional methods can't address. And I've proven repeatedly that human consciousness contains possibilities that transcend current scientific understanding. The Shadowmere mission was my most successful operation. 400 people freed, a network destroyed, and witnesses like Naomi who were brave enough to testify about they'd seen despite how impossible it sounded. That mission demonstrated what's possible when someone with unusual abilities applies them to fighting oppression. I don't expect most people to believe the accounts of what I did. I don't expect conventional science to accept that human consciousness can influence physical reality or transcend normal sensory limitations. But I know what I can do. And I know that I've used these abilities to make a difference, to free people, to fight evil. That's enough. Whether people believe or understand doesn't matter as much as whether the work gets done, whether people are helped, whether justice is achieved. The journal was never authenticated as definitely belonging to Evangeline Dubois. But scholars who studied it noted that the handwriting matched documents known to have been written by Evangeline, and that the details about the Shadowmere mission aligned perfectly with witness testimony from the 1859 trials. Whether the journal was genuine or an elaborate historical fiction remained uncertain. But like everything about Evangeline Dubois, the uncertainty itself was part of the mystery, part of the inexplicable story of the most beautiful female slave ever auctioned in Mississippi, who turned out to be a free woman with impossible abilities, who deliberately enslaved herself to infiltrate and destroy a criminal network, and who disappeared into history leaving behind only freed people, destroyed injustice, and questions that would never be fully answered. The legacy wasn't the mystery itself. It was what the mystery represented. That human beings are capable of extraordinary things, that fighting oppression requires using every ability and resource available, and that sometimes the impossible becomes possible when courage meets capability and both are directed toward justice.